I want to introduce another one of the year-long projects, the Rural Museum Partnership Team. And one of the really important things about science communication and science communication research is that we have to move past the container model. And this is a model where everybody does research and everybody does research, and we build up all of this research, all of these best practices, but then nobody puts them into practice. And so it's really important that we use the research to influence practice. And NCSE has started a rural museum collaborative in 2019. And we undertook this research project with the goal of improving our programmatic work, as well as helping others improve theirs. Um, so the Rural Museum team of Catherine, Emma, and Zach work to understand the needs of some of NCSE's most important partners, and also think about how understanding rural museum needs can influence the way that we think about science engagement. All right, Emma, Catherine, and Zach, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Thank you again for sticking with us today. So like other teams have mentioned, museums are such an important community asset, and they garner so much trust within their community. And this was really a way for us to be able to communicate climate change and evolution content with trusted folks in the community in other regions of the US, and really leverage that trust that they have. And also another point that's really interesting is there's a lot of literature and research around larger institutions and the partnerships that they embark on, but there's not a lot of information that we come across about smaller and rural museums. And so this was a really great way for NCSE to embark on this really important research, and like Kate mentioned, see how we could possibly implement some changes into our program as well. So like Kate mentioned, in 2019, she and I developed the Museum Collaborative, and it was a wonderful way to bring resources to these communities that often didn't have a lot of content around climate change or evolution. And it was a way for us to be able to support them and also begin to understand the discrepancies between their lived experiences and ours in our brick and mortar area in Oakland, where we have our office. And now bringing it to 2020, before the pandemic, we knew that we had some success with the Museum Collaborative, but we really were interested in learning about their exact needs, which really holds true to one of the emerging themes in the fellowship, which again is looking at that locale and that community and really thinking about their needs and how we can help them. And overall, we would love to, in the future, be able to use these findings to make some programmatic improvements. And so this overall project was broken down into 3 individual projects. So mine looked at the implications and impacts of small museums in their partnerships. And Catherine Henry and Zach Compton did a great amount of work. So much time went into this project, and they looked at 2 really intriguing case studies and did a deeper dive into their topics. Catherine Henry's topic was how climate change is perceived in small museums in Michigan. And you'll hear a little bit more about Zach Compton's project a little later on, about evolving beyond adaptation, problems and progress in human evolution exhibits. Now, taking a look at these 3 different projects, we really wanted to combine them and have some major takeaways. So next steps for us, like I mentioned earlier, we would love to use our findings to publish in journals, which we are in the progress of at the moment. And if we are accepted into journals, we'd love to also go to conferences and be able to share our findings to other communities as well. and also be able to use the data to develop some improvements into our Museum Collaborative program that already exists, as well as the Breaking Down Barriers program. And finally, we really want to build trust with the rural communities and with the museums. Again, they're so important and are very unique to their own communities, and we would love to be a part of that and see how we can help. So some of the methods that I used for my individual project began, like always, with some data collection and research. And I leveraged museums, USA.org, as well as Wikipedia to collect 124 names and contact information of rural museums and historic houses in the US. And based on the criteria that we were going for, which was a small staff size, lack of funding, or perhaps difficulty in finding infrastructure to do programming in, I then narrowed down that list to 75 sites. After I contacted those sites via email, phone, or contact form, 64 of those sites did not respond. 2 opted out, and 9 opted in to the research, which I was very excited about. From then, like other projects that were mentioned, these notes were turned into transcripts. And also, this information was organized into a SWOT analysis, which takes a look at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's a really great way to categorize qualitative data and begin to analyze it. And finally, with the creation of a code book, which was something that I did not know how to do until this year, so that was a really fun experience, was again taking a look at the questions that I asked in these semi-structured interviews, and taking a look at the most frequent answers, and again, categorizing them as a way to begin another step of the analysis process. And you can see the beginning of the codebook here on a simple Google Doc, and it was a way to list out the answers. And the final step was turning those answers into a spreadsheet. And what's fantastic is this is a great way to take the qualitative data and the really pertinent information from these interviews that just takes some, simple active listening and really turn it into quantitative data and begin to develop some figures. Overall, from the work that I did on these interviews, I came up with 2 different results. The first result being that small museums are often going to have a much more successful partnership with another organization and be able to fill a need if they're working with either similar size organizations or like-minded organizations. As you can see below in these 2 tables, these are some of the most common answers that I received when I asked the question about what were your partnerships like to these organizations, and what were some reasons for positive and negative partnerships that really either made or break the experience. One of which was an emphasis on finances, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And with the second result, speaking of finances, another aspect that really was important and was a major implication in partnerships was the idea of contractual agreements as well as money allocation. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with funds and how they relate to nonprofits, there are 2 major kinds of funds, and that is restricted funds and unrestricted. So restricted funds are great because they are often earmarked for very specific projects, and organizations know that they will in fact have that exact money to go towards a project. But with small museums who often have such unique needs that are constantly in flux, over the year, the scope of their projects may change. Unrestricted funds are really important to be able to fill those exact needs where it lies. And going off of that, some best practices that we came up with for this result was narrowing back into the agreement itself when partners go to embark on a collaboration. And one thing that's really important that became pretty apparent during these discussions is that kind of ties into some of those negative experiences is that some of these partners would lose communication with their other partners. They wouldn't know how often or how to communicate. They didn't know how much of their budget was going into this project. And so an MOU or a memorandum, of understanding really helps to create a more equitable and also transparent partnership. And now I'd like to pass it on to Catherine to discuss her findings in museums in Michigan.
Thanks, Emma. So now I'm going to talk to everyone about my kind of sub-project within this overall project. And I am a graduate student at Michigan State University in the forestry department, and I really came into that interest from forest ecology and specifically climate change was kind of my avenue for getting into this. So I was super excited to be able to take this research question and tailor it to my interests a little bit. So focusing on my state that I'm living in right now, I wanted to know what are the experiences of small and rural museums in discussing climate change content. So what are some of the challenges they face and how can we potentially assist with those challenges through partnering and help them learn to better communicate about climate change? And so focusing again just on Michigan, I identified museums which were science or science adjacent, perhaps natural history museums, that may touch on some form of science. And of those 18 museums, I heard back and had 10 participating museums. And so very similar to Emma's methods, I did semi-structured interviews over Zoom, which tended to be 30 to 90 minutes long. And after transcribing all of those interviews, I was able to code them and get some of the results that I'm now going to talk about. So starting off, museums and climate change. What were their past experiences and what are their inclinations for the future? These 10 circles that I have on the left here represent the 10 participating museums. And when I asked them about whether or not they had participated in sharing climate change content before, 7 of them said, no, we have not. And 3 of them said, yes, we have. So it may seem at first as though not many museums have climate change experience. But what I found was that after 3 of those museums self-identified that they didn't talk about climate change, they later revealed in the conversation that they had events that definitely did touch on climate change. So this was really interesting in that there's some sort of perception that people have that they're not talking about climate change. Perhaps they have a really narrow conceptualization of what it means to talk about climate change, but they actually do have more experience than they think they do, which is great. So with that kind of lens, most of the museums had some experience with climate change. And then when I asked them about their interest in the future, if they had any plans to talk about climate change content, one of them did actually have plans already in the works to include climate change content in the future. Another 3 museums had been discussing with people the possibilities and already had some discussions going on in the works. And then the remaining 5 museums were all open and interested. Nobody told me they didn't want to talk about climate change. One of them I was not able to assess for their future interests. So overall, this is great that museums are really interested and open to talking about climate change in the future. So if they're interested in starting to talk about climate change, what are some of the barriers or challenges that they're facing when they're presenting this content? So these are 2 of my results that I'm going to highlight. And one of the most common results, which 4 museums mentioned, was that they had this perception that climate change is difficult to make hands-on. I have this quote here: climate change is kind of nebulous. How do you do an exhibit that can be hands-on? So they were not sure about how to make it hands-on. And that was something that a lot of museums that I spoke to really prided themselves on, was being an interactive experience. So feeling like climate change isn't hands-on is a barrier to being a hands-on museum from their perception. Of course, we know that climate change, of course, can be very hands-on for learning. And Another common challenge was that climate change is difficult to talk about, which 6 museums reported. And although nobody responded that they were so nervous about public pushback that they didn't want to talk about climate change, and most people thought that it would be pretty minor, they did reveal that they had conceptualizations that climate change is politically charged, or perhaps that climate change is not appropriate content for younger children. And so they have some conceptualizations about climate change and definitely anticipate some potentially awkward or uncomfortable situations. And so this is definitely something that organizations like NCSC are well equipped to deal with. But this is another common hurdle that would have to be overcome for a museum to continue to talk about climate change. So with all of these different challenges, as my kind of takeaway message would be that small and rural museums are a potential to focus on local climate change solutions. A lot of people were concerned that maybe climate change didn't fit into their mission or their theme, or that they're so locally focused, they don't know how to make it hands-on and they don't want to do it. But rather than this being a concern, this is actually a great opportunity for them to talk about climate change because they can make it tangible and relevant to people about how climate change is affecting their community. And so to overcome these challenges, partners should help connect them to climate change resources, content, lesson plans, and maybe do some rethinking about what it means to talk about climate change and how can you tailor a message that involves climate change to match up with the museum. And so, because at the end of the day, whether a museum chooses to talk about climate change or not, they're definitely making a message about it. And I'm going to turn it over now to Zach, who's going to talk kind of on the flip side about evolution and about how the way that museums can influence the way that people perceive evolution and adaptation.
Thanks, Catherine. So prior to the pandemic, I was really interested in going out into museums that I had worked with locally here and across the country and doing a physical survey of evolution museums, human evolution exhibits, and how their physical and spatial layout conveyed meaning and interpretation to the participants. Obviously, coming into the pandemic, that stifled my plans to be in a museum in person. So Kate and I decided to take a step back and when we talk about forming best practices. So when these bridges of communication and partnership can be reopened after the pandemic, what will that look like when we coming in as a true partner with these museums and identifying what best practices would look like and not just kind of a commentary on what they're doing perhaps incorrect. So here on the first slide, we have a famous kind of classic evolution exhibit at the American Museum of Natural History. And this is really kind of characteristic of a lot of the exhibits that we were trying to identify in this analysis. And to their credit, they've identified this since, and this is kind of a teaching example of kind of the misconceptions that can be conveyed in physical evolution exhibits. But here we have the evolution of the horse lineage, and you see like this perfect progression where both change is continuous and progressive the entire time. And that's really kind of is the first step in creating a misconception for participants in this museum. If we can go to the next slide. So in drafting the paper Kate and I did, Evolving Beyond Adaptation, we wanted to both identify the misconceptions, both kind of lighthearted and the more pernicious, that adaptation-based evolution exhibits can portray to the participants of that exhibit. And also, what are some interventional curricula that we can write up that preserves, as Abigail pointed out in her genetics presentation, the best way to teach evolution and the most effective way is to make it personable. And to doing that, focusing on human evolution exhibits and focusing on adaptation, that's a surefire way to garner attention at the site of the exhibit. And we've designed some curricula that we think preserves that personal touch that human evolution, the fundamental intrigue that human evolution provides, while incorporating mechanisms that are beyond the traditional adaptation-centric exhibits identified here. Next slide. So we kind of started with 4 central museums that had some of really identified as having some of the largest human evolution exhibits in the country. And they're evaluating them for their kind of emphasis on evolutionary mechanism, given here most of it's adaptation centric, and also what does the physical layout look like? And of course, we're not there physically now. So all of this analysis had to be done kind of through pictures and such. And through this, for most of these, another reason kind of identifying these big 4 museum exhibits is all of them had, to our great benefit, had some complementary literature that had supported kind of the same line of thinking that we're interested in, which is, these museum exhibits are over-reliant on adaptation. And more than likely, a lot of these participants are leaving this exhibit with some kind of misconception of evolutionary theory, whether mechanistic or academic or societal, and both damaging as we try to use museum sites as very productive sites of education. So if we go to our next slide. So on the first slide where we have that horse exhibit where change is portrayed as both continuous and constantly progressive, that's kind of what we'll call like the first layer of misconceptions that adaptation-centric exhibits can introduce, and certainly the least pernicious. When we consider what might be the most pernicious belief or takeaway that some of these participants leave the exhibit with, we have this paper that we highlighted in our paper, Changing Museums Visitors' Conceptions of Evolution. And not only were there like a plethora of very kind of minor misconceptions you can imagine are easily addressed through further evolution education, there was also some that you would classify as extremely pernicious, such as that the adaptation is scaling with the migration out of Africa into Western Europe, and that some regions and populations in the country may be more or less adapted than others. And that's kind of a two-pronged misconception. One, you have the language of more or less adapted being kind of incongruent with evolutionary thinking. And then beyond that, the more pernicious belief that there is these substantial differences in human populations as far as one could classify adaptiveness. Next slide. And so finally, like I said, we want to preserve the personal touch that human evolution, why it creates such a draw. And luckily, in the past decade, we have this emergent field of evolutionary medicine, and it provides an amazing framework to identify both adaptive mechanisms in human change and human evolution, but also the non-adaptive mechanisms of human change. And taking it one step further than just being human evolution, we also have as an explanatory framework for the persistence and prevalence of modern human diseases. And neutral mechanisms of evolutionary change like genetic drift offer an excellent understanding for the penetrance of these diseases in modern human populations. Thank you. I think I'll pass it back to Emma to wrap us up.
Thanks so much, Catherine and Zach. And I want to say also a big thank you to Kate for spearheading this project as well. And with these interests that we had for our individual projects, we were able to come together and think about what emerging themes we could bring back to NCSE. So one of the emerging themes that we came across to successfully partner with a small museum, thinking about other organizations like ourselves or larger institutions who are also interested in helping. You really want to be cognizant of their unique needs and don't be afraid to ask questions. Be adaptive to the challenges that they face in order to build trust, just like these museums do within their own communities. And you really want to be responsive to their needs and to the unique assets that they give to their community, but also thinking about how you can bring that further and bridge some of the gaps in their needs by providing resources, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So what does this mean for NCSE? Well, in our name, the National Center for Science Education, we are so lucky that we have really amazing partners all over the US. And so for our organization as a whole, it would be really fantastic if we could continue to network and provide educational resources for communities all over the US, like we do not only in Breaking Down Barriers, but with Catalyzing Action and with the teacher support programs as well. Now zooming back into the Breaking Down Barriers program, we are hoping to continue to understand the needs of rural and small museums and leverage the fellowship as a really great way to provide local expertise and a resource network, as well as some other resources such as our kits to these areas and be able to really close the gaps. So thank you again